In December 1984, American TV producer Jamie Shandera received a 35mm film in the mail. Once developed, it revealed 8 pages of a document describing an underground organization that was created in 1947 to deal with all information relating to UFOs. Supposedly, for more than 50 years, this ultra-secret organization was part of a vast worldwide conspiracy designed to conceal the truth about visits by extraterrestrials. The code name for this elite group was Majestic 12, or MJ-12. Just how long do you think a worldwide conspiracy can be kept secret from the entire population? Can a small group of people maintain secrecy about world issues? Where does the disinformation end and the conspiracy begin? In the United States, where the Air Force investigated flying saucers for more than 20 years, the Pentagon has stated that it has no reason to continue these investigations, that all information collected to date is available, and that it has nothing to hide where UFOs are concerned. Not everyone agrees with this statement. Through legal means, American UFO experts have forced several government agencies, such as the NSA, CIA, and FBI, to release hundreds of pages of documents which they had previously claimed did not exist. If we add to these lies rumors of recovered spaceships and intimidating men in black, then the idea of a worldwide cover-up doesn't seem so far-fetched. But is there any truth to these rumors? In 1989, a man named Robert Lazar came out with wild speculations regarding secret military facilities in the Nevada desert, the legendary Area 51.
Alors Robert Lazar est un personnage assez critiqué, même extrêmement critiqué.
Bob Lazar has received a lot of criticism.
Physicien qui
He
a
was a young physicist who made a sensational statement
racontant qu'il avait
that he had worked for a short time at an ultra-secret underground military base known as Area 51, near Groom Lake, north of Las Vegas.
Au nord de Las Vegas. Et
he claimed that he had been hired to study the recovered spaceships.
I
think perhaps the most controversial claims were those of Bob Lazar, who claims he was a nuclear physicist taken to a secret base 15 miles south of Groom Lake at Papoose Dry Lake and asked to work on the part of the propulsion system of an alien vehicle. Unfortunately, Bob Lazar claims he is a nuclear physicist. That's absolute nonsense. He doesn't have any degrees of any kind whatsoever. And when Stanton Friedman asked him basic questions about physics, known, in high school textbooks, he was unable to answer them.
But Lazar's problems were more than academic. In 1990, he was arrested and charged with pandering. In the field of investigation, it is said that information is only as reliable as its source. Robert Lazar's credibility is rather doubtful. But thanks to him, it became public knowledge that odd things were happening at Area 51. Several films were produced by amateurs near Groom Lake, showing bright objects performing aviation maneuvers that were out of the ordinary. Were these objects the byproduct of alien technology? Since the Groom Lake facilities were built in 1954 as a result of an agreement between the CIA and the Lockheed Aviation Corporation, they have been used to develop secret aircraft such as the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and stealth aircraft such as the F-117A and the B-2 bomber. These days, with an increase in the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs, Aircraft capable of performing feats that are impossible for conventional aircraft, it's only natural for us to wonder about the object seen over Area 51. The rumor still persists that the military secretly recovered an alien spaceship and used it to make technological advances. Shortly before he died in 1998, Colonel Philip Corso, a retired American military officer, published a book called The Day After Roswell. Corso described how the Army tried to make technological advances using a spaceship that was recovered in 1947 near Roswell, New Mexico.
According to his story, at one point, his boss at the Pentagon, General Trudeau, gave him UFO remnants that had been stored in an Army locker. I've intentionally mentioned that it was the Army, since it seems that it was mostly the Air Force and perhaps the Marines who led the secret operations. The Army was more behind the scenes. Maybe they had wanted to play a role at that point. So Trudeau gave these remnants to Colonel Corso to play around with and try to find some use for. They decided to pass the remnants on to a few laboratories very secretly, with the instructions to do what you want with this, try to find some way of using it, and patent your ideas.
One thing that was supposedly developed using alien technology was the transistor. Unfortunately, upon checking with the patent office, we discovered that these semiconductors were patented well before the Roswell affair. But French scientist Jean-Pierre Petit, one of the main researchers into magnetohydrodynamics, or MHD, believes that alien technology has been used to make human technological advances. In his most recent book, UFOs and Classified American Weapons, he said that while attending a conference on advanced propulsion, a few of his American counterparts confided some surprising information.
When I discussed the matter with American scientists, they were quite glib. They admitted to having recovered an alien hypersonic shuttle in Roswell in 1947, not a ship designed for long space travel. So from then on, they had concrete evidence that MHD existed. A decision was made from above that we don't want a repeat of what happened with the atomic bomb. We want this to stay strictly American. So I want you to disinform the public. Their plan worked magnificently. What's interesting is that MHD sank like a ship. It just disappeared altogether in the early 1970s. In the US, they had developed it in Area 51 in an ultra-secret underground laboratory. I went to Berkeley to give a lecture in 1987 at the invitation of my friend Tony Oppenheim, who worked for the Department of Fluid Mechanics. In the back of the room sat a Professor Kunkel, who was constantly fidgeting. And Oppenheim said to Kunkel, "Why were you so fidgety during the lecture?" And Kunkel replied, "I'm very embarrassed because a lot of what that Frenchman was saying is actually being studied in secret labs here in the United States, like Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. But here it's such a secret that I'm not even authorized to talk about it." Here he was seeing this French scientist casually explaining MHD to second-year students when it was supposed to be top secret in the United States. So it was a bit of a blunder. That's why the Americans were laughing. As people from Brighton told me, our military secrets are in your comic books.
As it turns out, the information on MHD was not the only thing that was revealed to Professor Petit. He also learned that Americans supposedly had a torpedo capable of traveling 2,000 miles per hour and a hypersonic airplane capable of orbiting Earth. What's more, the U.S. had allegedly already sent manned flights to Mars. The scientist believed all of this information without hesitation. What if Jean-Pierre Petit was merely the victim of a disinformation scheme, like those accredited to the mysterious Men in Black? Among the favorite topics of conspiracy theorists is the strange Men in Black, who first appeared under rather odd circumstances.
Dans les années 50,
in the 1950s, other than UFO experts who belonged to what we might call serious mainstream groups, it's hard to qualify groups like that, but some published books at the beginning of the UFO movement, so we might call them serious. Anyways, other than those serious groups, smaller groups popped up as well, one of which had a memorable character named Gray Barker. Gray Barker was an American who became interested in flying saucers in the early 1950s. He joined a small group on the East Coast led by UFO expert Albert Bender. This was about the time that the smaller groups were being created, when the article by Kehoe was published, and articles on the subject were appearing in major newspapers. A lot of people began thinking, hey, I'm interested in that too. I think I'll start my own group, or I'll publish a fan magazine, or I'll write books on the subject. In actual fact, not too many people wrote books. Most wrote bulletins. So there were quite a few small groups. Gray Barker joined a group that claimed to have contacts around the world. Each time that someone wrote to them, the person would become a contact, so their network spread quickly. And then something odd happened to this group. Its president, Al Bender, suddenly dropped all of his activities. This was a mystery to his friends who wondered what had happened. He told them that he had been visited by 3 mysterious men in black who told him to drop his interest in the subject. Apparently, he was too close to the truth, which made him a dangerous element, and these men had come to intimidate him and tell him to drop the subject. These men were dressed in black, wore felt hats, and drove a Cadillac just like the stereotypes seen in the movie of the same name, Men in Black. This was the first report of the Men in Black. Unlike Bender, Gray Barker decided not to drop the subject, and he decided to investigate the matter. In 1956, he wrote a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was the first book written on this subject. Since then, the Men in Black have become a known element among UFO circles, although the subject remained on the fringes for a long time. Most ufologists did not take the matter seriously. These Men in Black were not attention grabbers like UFOs, which were a more serious issue, a more scientific matter. But the idea persisted over the years, and now the public in general has heard of Men in Black thanks to Hollywood.
In his book, Gray Barker gave the impression that these Men in Black might be federal agents, specifically FBI agents. That inference did not go unnoticed. In January 1959, the Federal Bureau of Investigation told its Chicago agents that it wanted a copy of Barker's book. They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Upon investigation, Edgar Hoover's men concluded that the FBI had not been involved in what happened to Albert Bender. Could someone else be interfering?
Gray Barker publie son livre en 1956.
Gray Barker published his book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, in 1956. Over the next few years, several UFO experts visited Al Bender in the hopes of hearing his version of what had happened. But he remained silent. He didn't say anything or do anything. In 1958 or 1959, he wrote an article on so-called revelations, but his article didn't really reveal anything. It just described how he had been harassed for years. In 1962, Gray Barker published a book which was a manuscript prepared by Bender telling his version of the story. The UFO community was disappointed, since this book did not reflect what Barker had said in his first book. The Men in Black were neither government agents nor fifth-column aliens. They were aliens based in the Antarctic. The story was nothing more than really bad science fiction. Most people I've spoken with in UFO circles believe that it was nothing more than fiction, and bad fiction at that, since he was claiming that these beings would materialize in his home out of thin air. They were male and female beings. In fact, Bender's manuscript even contained stories that bordered on eroticism. He claimed that the aliens took him to their base. They told him that they had come to Earth because our water contained some element that they needed for their planet. Supposedly, they headed back to their planet in 1960 or 1961, and that was when Bender could finally reveal his secret. Up until then, the aliens had been telling him, "Don't talk about this." And that was why Bender had given up his study group, because the extraterrestrial beings had politely asked him not to reveal their existence. As you can see, this story was very bizarre. It reflected Bender's personality, since he was not a typical UFO expert. Even Barker, who added his own personal notes to the book, since it seems that the manuscript was badly written, said that he had a hard time believing Bender's story. So the whole issue of Men in Black got pushed to the fringes of the UFO community, even though it ended up being discussed more than other issues.
Apart from the myth created by Barker and Bender, UFO literature is filled with stories of Men in Black. They seem to be everywhere in the 1960s. In 1967, the U.S. Air Force issued a memo to its staff advising them that individuals dressed in civilian clothes were posing as members of an elite branch of NORAD, visiting witnesses who had seen a UFO and asking them not to say anything about what they had seen. The Air Force also stated that these visitors were imposters, and any officer with information regarding these individuals should immediately notify his superiors. In her book, The Truth Behind Men in Black, British UFO expert Jenny Randles describes dozens of cases where people were visited by men in black, extending from the 1950s up to the present. So if the MIB are not agents working for a secret government agency, then who are they?
I'm very interested by the so-called men in black cases. Undoubtedly there is a phenomenon of some sort here, whether it's connected to the UFO mystery or whether it's perhaps a separate but related paranormal phenomena, I don't know. But I can't help but think it's more likely that there are two rather more ordinary things going on here. Firstly, perhaps somebody deliberately hoaxing people who want to believe perhaps a little bit too much in extraterrestrials and playing a trick on them. Secondly, the sorts of people who do enjoy dressing as and pretending to be, say, secret agents. And it seems to me that it is a well-known psychological and psychiatric phenomenon that there are people, for example, who dress as police officers or as paramedics and who have their uniforms, and they enjoy, it fulfills some sort of psychological need to be seen in this role. It doesn't seem to me too far-fetched to suggest that a lot of people might enjoy posing as an agent of some shadowy government agency.
Is there a secret agency? Why not MJ-12? In November 1950, upon his return to Ottawa after a visit to the American capital, Wilbur Smith, an engineer working for the Federal Department of Transport, submitted a trip report to his superiors. Smith stated that in the U.S., the whole subject of flying saucers was classified more confidential than the H-bomb. And a group had been set up to study them, led by Dr. Vannevar Bush, President Truman's scientific advisor. Rumors of this secret group charged with studying flying saucers have persisted to this day. In the early 1950s, Captain Edward Ruppelt was director of Project Blue Book, an American committee set up to investigate UFOs. In his book, Reports on Unidentified Flying Objects, he explained that during his term as director, he had the feeling that a secret organization was also working on the same subject. What was this mysterious organization?
There are many MJ-12 documents. One of the documents that first came was the Eisenhower briefing document, and that arrived at the home of Jamie Chandray in the form of 2 rolls of undeveloped film, or maybe 1 roll of undeveloped film with 16 frames. But each of the frames sets now are in the possession of 2 people. One of them is Bill Moore, and the other is Jamie Chandray. They were identical sets, and I was able to get a copy of one of the sets from Jamie Chandray, which includes the famous Truman-Forrestal memo, which was the 1947 memo that presumably kicked off the Majestic 12 program.
The first 6 pages, apparently written in November 1952 and addressed to President-elect Dwight Eisenhower, were basically a briefing note describing the objectives of a project named Majestic 12, or MJ-12. This was followed by 2 pages of appendices and a memo dated September 24th, 1947, signed by the president at that time, Harry Truman. In the memo, the president authorized Secretary of Defense James Forrestal to proceed with an operation referred to as MJ-12, with the assistance of Dr. Bush, the White House's scientific advisor. The documents were stamped top secret, magic, and eyes only.
The MJ-12 program was the program that was begun and initiated by Truman, according to the documents, in 1947. And it has remained, apparently, from the documents that I have, continuous under various names, but including Majestic 12 or MJ12, up to at least 1976.
These documents focused on the Roswell affair and spoke of the creation of an ultra-secret group, Majestic 12, which was supposed to be aware of everything relating to UFOs in Roswell.
Since then, it appears that the scope of the program has broadened to understand how they work, maybe to begin some reverse engineering process, because one of the documents that I have from about 1952 seems to summarize what we've learned about the technologies.
These sheets were not the only ones of their kind. Over the next few years, other similar documents were sent to UFO experts, always anonymously. One of the most important documents was a sort of operating manual for MJ-12 agents.
After I retired in 1993, a friend of mine, Stan Friedman, who's well known in the UFO community, said that he thought that he knew that Don Berliner, who is actually the head of the Fund for UFO Research now, had received some documents in the mail that I might be interested in looking at. Okay. So I asked Don Berliner if he could share these documents with me. He ran a copy of them, but they weren't very good. So I went and visited Don in Washington, and together we found a black and white photographic shop and made extremely good copies, which I purchased. And then from those copies, I recreated the manual, which turns out to be a manual, a special operations manual, Psalm 101, that allegedly explains to the troops in the field how to recover a crashed UFO, how to deceive the public that there's anything there, and where to ship the bodies and where to send the parts.
When the first MJ-12 documents were received in the mid-1980s, several UFO experts studied them in the hopes of finding clues as to whether they were genuine or fake. Their results led to a general state of skepticism.
It seems clear to me that studies into these documents by investigators such as Barry Greenwood, Robert Todd, and others showed that these documents were fakes. First of all, in one of the memos allegedly signed by Truman, the president's signature had been photocopied from another document, which was genuine and which can be found at the National Archives Office. The rest was a mixture of items commonly found in UFO literature, but there was nothing that pointed to a real American operation. The authenticity of these documents was doubtful, and they were the beginning of a history of fakes, which show up in all areas, including UFO circles, unfortunately.
I think the test of time has not been good on MJ-12. Given the amount of whistleblowing, given the amount of ways in which secrets are really blown by a very invasive press and media, that something that big could be covered up that long is very difficult to believe. That the Americans could actually have a flying saucer and alien bodies over 50 years, guarded by many troops, guarded by or used by scientists, even the amount of cleaners that would have to go through a base on that over 50 years. There's a lot of people that, if they could just produce one piece of proof that would blow the story, would interest anybody of a serious investigative reporting nature. And yet the serious investigative reporters, the sort of the Paxmans and the Cronkites, don't get involved in this kind of stuff because the real evidence that they would rely on, that they would demand, has not been forthcoming. MJ-12 looks good superficially until you ask, well, why was it given to those people? If you were a government person and you wanted people to know this, you could take that evidence with its kind of guarantees to people like Cronkite, and if you could convince them, then you've got your story out. To give it to UFO proponents is a guaranteed way, almost, of in fact getting it ridiculed. Now, if that was the government that actually gave the MJ-12 documents, I would suggest that it's not because the MJ-12 documents are genuine, but that the government wanted to see the rumour, to see how it would work and what would happen and so on. And if they're involved, then I think it was quite deliberate. And in fact, I believe Linda Moulton Howe, who is perhaps more famous for her work on animal mutilations and so on, she told the story of actually being taken into a room, being shown documents very much like MJ-12, then having them taken away from her and told never show those to anybody, never tell anybody you saw them. Well, the simple answer is, if you don't want her to tell anybody, why show her to them in the first place? Clearly, someone was trying to manipulate her. I think she was a bit savvy on this one, but clearly they were trying to manipulate her. And I think the release of those documents in the way they came out was another, perhaps slightly clumsy way of doing this kind of let's see what happens in the population, which I think is what's behind it.
Not many UFO experts believe in the MJ-12 affair. But if these documents were fake, then what explains the rumors about secret groups?
Other
Other than MJ-12, there was an ongoing tradition of secret groups that supposedly studied UFOs, with most of these being American. This was mentioned in Ruppelt's book, Report on UFOs in 1956. He spoke of a group linked to the President of the United States that came to investigate his Blue Book files. Then there was Wilbur Smith in the 1950s, who wrote a memo mentioning how he had met with individuals from the American government. So there were a lot of stories circulating about these secret groups. As for Ruppelt's story, it seems obvious to me that the President would have had advisors keeping him informed of what was happening, and naturally they would have taken an interest in the UFO matter. We know that Americans studied UFOs. However, there are enough records available in public archives now for us to cross-check information. And I don't get the impression that there was a group spending all of its time on the matter. At least, it doesn't seem very likely. It's possible that there were times when the subject was particularly sensitive, like during the wave of sightings in 1952 when UFOs were flying over Washington, and the President would have said to his advisors, I want to report on this. I want to know what's going on. Also, during periods of tension with the Russians, the U.S. government might have been interested in certain matters. That's highly likely. But there's been no ongoing effort since then. And what's important to remember is that these individuals did not have the answers. That's important. In any conspiracy theory, there is a tendency to think that people in power know everything about the matter. The attitude is that they've known everything from the start. My impression is that they were just as lost as everyone else, and they were asking themselves the same questions. So it's hard to imagine that they worked continually on the UFO issue, unless they found something along the way, which doesn't seem very likely. Obviously, they asked themselves the same questions as everyone else, but they didn't find any answers. And UFOs were not their #1 problem at the time. They had other fish to fry. If UFOs had been clearly linked to the Russians at the time, then it would have been a highly sensitive matter. I'm sure it would have occurred to them, but they would have eliminated that theory. UFOs were neither aliens nor Russians. They tended to have the attitude that it's only a pop culture phenomenon. Psychologists succeeded in calming down the population. It was a time when people were still strongly superstitious, although that tendency was starting to fade. It was easy to sweep the problem under the carpet.
It is my belief that something like that type of organization has existed, and whether or not something like that still exists, I'm not as certain, but I'm willing to guess that it probably does. I say this on the basis of a variety of statements made by former Air Force officer Edward Ruppelt, who I think alluded to the existence of such an organization. I also believe that I think it makes sense, to be quite honest with you. You know, let us play a little historical game, and let's pretend that the year is 1947 and that your name is Harry Truman. And let us just say for the moment that you indeed have information or even possibly technology that is alien in origin. What would you do? Certainly we know that in 1947 the United States did have a monopoly of very important technology, and that was nuclear technology. In 1947, the United States had a monopoly of working nuclear bombs. And at that time, the entire rest of the world was pounding at the door of the United Nations, basically wanting the U.S. to make nuclear technology public under the control of the UN. And the United States answer at that time was absolutely no way. We know this. So therefore, ask yourself a very simple question. If they're not willing to let atomic technology out to the rest of the world, what would they possibly do with something as exotic as alien technology? Well, I think the answer would be to make it as secret from yourself even as possible, knowing that Soviet agents did indeed penetrate your own scientific and intelligence community, which was certainly the case. It would be something that you would want to have as much a high degree of security protocol as possible around. That's a hypothesis. However, I think it's one that fits the known facts very well. So the jury is still out on the existence of an actual MJ-12, but I think that, again, I think that it is a reasonable supposition to say that something like it did occur and does exist.
While rumors were spreading of alien technology, men in black and shadowy underground organizations, even more radical statements were being made, especially in the early 1980s. According to authors such as Milton William Cooper and David Icke, aliens had been captured and assimilated into the human race in a much more gruesome scenario in which the role of the U.S. Army went far beyond simply recovering a crashed UFO.
This story of an alien conspiracy linked to the American government and multinational corporations is just another piece to the puzzle. Conspiracy theorists believe that throughout the world, especially in the United States, underground alien bases exist with 5 or 6 levels, literally teeming with aliens. Allegedly, there are thousands of aliens living in these bases, and their only goal is to use humans, raising them like cattle for reproductive research, or interbreeding races to create aliens capable of living among humans without being noticed. I recently met individuals who were convinced of this theory. These people seem quite normal and friendly on the surface, but then they get into a state of extreme paranoia when they become convinced that the enemy is everywhere. In their minds, walls have ears, and we are being watched at all times. And worst of all, there has been an infiltration from outer space, with the consent of governments and major financial institutions throughout the world.
This partnership between aliens and the military is supposedly being overseen by covert groups such as Illuminatis and the Freemasons, whose vast financial resources are being used to set up a new world order. Luckily, this belief is only supported by militants who use UFOs as an excuse for inventing the worst scenarios possible. To them, any official story is nothing more than a smokescreen designed to cover up horrible conspiracies, from the existence of aliens to flu epidemics spread intentionally by multinational pharmaceutical companies in cohort with governments throughout the world.
Since
the 1950s, there have always been groups insisting that the truth about UFOs is being kept from the public, that authorities know more than they are telling, that the military should be forced to release all of its more revealing files and so forth. Over the past couple of decades, these cries have gotten louder, especially in the United States, where they have been taken up by individuals close to the military, right-wing groups who tend to interpret everything in terms of a conspiracy theory. A few UFO experts are very interested in these conspiracy theories, which raises 2 points. Obviously, a debate surfaces over what is acceptable and what isn't in the case of a controversy. Also, is it necessary to associate yourself with these types of people and theories to be considered credible? Of course not. It's like saying that to be a politician in France, you have to join the National Front Party. That's not a very pleasant perspective.
Extremist views risk damaging what little credibility has been gained to date in the field of ufology. I think that some people are just too gung-ho. They reach a point of no return and gradually lose touch with reality.
If UFOs spotted over Area 51 are nothing more than remotely guided prototypes and not alien spacecraft, if men in black are more of a myth than a real censorship committee, and if the existence of a secret group like MJ-12 is still very uncertain, then where does that leave us in terms of a worldwide conspiracy theory? Somewhere between rationalists who claim that governments are transparent and flying saucer buffs who see every new official document as further proof of a large-scale conspiracy, there lies a middle ground, which seems to make sense.
Many people feel that the government has been involved with a kind of a cover-up, but the idea is that we know an awful lot about things that happen in the American government and in the Canadian government, of course. And particularly with the American government, it's very difficult to keep secrets if they become political footballs. The Clinton-Lewinsky case, the innermost secrets of their personal relationships were revealed to the entire world. And all sorts of other secrets have come forward. And yet at the same time, it is said that if the government is keeping a secret about UFOs, this is the best kept secret ever, because we will hear something about the subject once in a while and then nothing, and it's all sort of kept under wraps. Well, in my opinion, and I'm in a minority of researchers about this, I believe that if the government was studying this subject and had mounted an enormously huge study, which they would have to, if they knew that there was something to this subject, they would expend a tremendous amount of resources studying it. And it would be for half a century that we would know this. We would, in fact, know this. There would be generations of scientists who work on the subject, and generations and generations and generations of politicians through 11 different presidential administrations who have worked on it. And it would be expanding almost in a cone-like effect, more and more people becoming involved with it, and we'd know it. Now, the problem with conspiracy theories is that there is no such thing as deniability. Every time the government says, no, it's not true, that becomes evidence of the cover-up. So it's not falsifiable, as they say. You can't ever prove it's not happening. Everything is in service of the conspiracy. So I caution my colleagues to be extremely careful with this.
Through my contacts and research, I have met quite a few UFO researchers throughout the world. For professional reasons, I have had to travel to several countries in the world. I had a chance to mix business with pleasure. And I'm still not convinced that there's a worldwide conspiracy by government leaders. I'm positive that over the past 50 or so years, a certain number of investigations, reports, and conclusions were kept under wraps. Of that, I'm sure. But I think that the governments were just doing their job. They were faced with unusual phenomena, and they investigated. That's normal. That's what they're supposed to do. It follows that if they were unable to come to any definite conclusions at the time, if they couldn't explain what was happening, then they wouldn't want to admit it. That's just normal as well. The same thing applies in other areas as well. When the French government wasted billions of taxpayer dollars, it didn't go around bragging. It tried to conceal the fact from the public. As far as UFOs are concerned, I think it's simply a case where the governments could not come to any definite conclusions about what they had on their hands, so they preferred not to talk about it. I positively do not believe in the conspiracy theory that little gray men or reptilian beings are trying to establish a new world order, using Illuminatis to hide the truth as they prepare to colonize the world.
I think there's evidence that at some level there's evasion. I'm not one to buy into a great organized conspiracy, but there's often uneven release policies between the various agencies. It's a touchy subject, and you know, you have to wonder, I'll tell you. I sometimes think, you know, when the excuse of national security is used, that it's not so much national security but national insecurity. Some of these people have huge budgets, and they're responsible for the penetration of our skies and defense systems and oceans, and they don't like to say, we don't know. The evidence is that we're not ready yet to face the fact that we may not be alone, or that we're not at the top of the pecking order. Look, 50% of the North American public fear we're not alone. 10% of this same North American public claim sightings and encounters. In fact, in Canada, the percentages are higher than in the US. It's a scary thought to think that we can't be sure of that, and these things move at will and whatever. And I can tell you that if you're an air traffic controller or an astronomer, UFOs are a reality. They may not be quick to say that they're a vehicle of extraterrestrial origin, but they're a problem, in fact, a life that have to be dealt with. UFOs are real. I don't know what they are, but they're there. And I'll tell you, sometimes the fear of the unknown encroaches on these people who are not really trained to deal with it, but if you receive a complaint, these people must respond and must deal with it. And, you know, they do the best they can sometimes.
In Canada, I haven't seen the government try to hide anything from me. I would go so far as to say that the government doesn't know anything. The military doesn't know anything. The police doesn't know anything either. Their silence proves that they don't know anything. Obviously, it could be interpreted as them hiding a big secret from us, but it's better for them to keep quiet because it's less disturbing to the population. It's somehow reassuring to believe that they're hiding something from us. We don't need to panic because the military are protecting the sky and the police are protecting the ground. So perhaps it's best that they keep quiet. I am convinced of one thing, however. There are military officers who use their rank in much the same way that you might use the photocopier or the computer at the office to cut down on personal costs, sending faxes to Europe at the company's expense rather than having to pay for them yourself. Well, a high-ranking officer might just turn to a sergeant or a corporal and say, "Go to the St. Hubert military base. A UFO landed near there. Investigate the matter and write me up a report. Don't ask any questions because I'm a colonel and you're a corporal and you have no business asking questions. Take the jeep, go with one of your soldiers and check it out. When these two men get home, they might tell their wives that the army just sent them to investigate a UFO. And when women hear things from the military, they talk amongst themselves. It only takes two people for a rumor to start spreading. I think that at certain levels of the Army, not only here in Canada, but elsewhere in the world as well, there are officers who use their rank and position for their own personal gain, to gather information. They aren't instructed to gather the information. They do it out of personal interest, which doesn't necessarily mean that the Army itself is hiding anything.
I tend not to believe that there's a widespread cover-up. If there is a cover-up, it probably is one more of ignorance. That is, the government says, maybe this UFO phenomenon is important. We don't understand it. We can't admit that publicly, so we, of course, will stay quiet about whatever we're doing. I've certainly heard stories, I've heard rumors, I've even talked to some people that have told me or others about secret projects and so forth. I've never come across any evidence that absolutely convinced me that there is a cover-up. I have come across evidence, though, that has shown that the U.S. government has done a miserable job at studying the phenomena and was greatly affected, for example, by the Cold War and the American policies, the government policies that basically said secrecy was critical in all aspects of the military and industrial complex because of our Cold War with the Russians, Soviets. And this affected their attitudes toward UFOs because it turned out that UFO sightings might have been exploited for psychological reasons, possibly they thought by the Soviets and other things, so that what really should have been an open scientific study about UFOs was turned into something else by other factors, these social factors, I think, and political factors.
While it cannot be denied that governments are not always forthcoming when it comes to information about UFOs, there is also no proof of a vast cover-up operation. In a lot of cases, it's clear that information was kept secret due to the fear that reigned during the Cold War, the fear of a Russian invasion. We must be wary of wild rumors and documents whose meaning has been misconstrued. On the other hand, it's clear that for more than 50 years, there has been an ongoing campaign of disinformation where UFOs are concerned. The confusion has not been caused by shadowy secret services or elite branches of the government. No, in this game of true or false, the threat comes from within. After having promoted sensational stories over and over that could not be proven, The more zealous ufologists have muddled the subject of UFOs more than all government agencies combined. With total disregard for the facts, and often with a blazing desire to make their point, these militants have not hesitated to alter facts or completely ignore certain details to justify their cause, which just goes to show that when it comes to mixing up the truth, we do a good job of it ourselves. And with the invention of the internet, there's no doubt that the nightmare has already begun. To quote David Vincent, star of the fictional series, The Invaders.